Hello and welcome to the Dr. Squee show. Thank you everyone for joining us. We're going to be talking today to my guest, which for anyone who caught last weekend's Sci-Fi in the Sky, the fantastic live version that we did across the internets for Sci-Fi Weekender last weekend, I spoke to my guest now a week ago, and we're going to continue the chat. So if you didn't catch that, it's absolutely fine. Don't worry. It's going to be all new stuff, and we're going to release the whole thing as one big podcast later. So if you want to catch that, please go to, if I can get it up. Hey, how fancy is this? Please go to drsquee.com where you can follow the podcast and you can catch all our podcasted episodes. And please go to your favorite podcast catcher and subscribe. It really helps us out, either on Apple or any of the different podcast apps. Cool. But that having been said, my guest this week, as I said, as it was last week, is the great grandnephew of Bram Stoker, the man behind Dracula. Not only does he have a fantastic history himself, but he has done a forensic search back on his great grand uncle. Please welcome to the show, Mr. Dacre Stoker.
That's a great introduction. It's a hard act to follow. I'll do my best today.
So it'll be a case of kind of trying to remember where we went up to last time. Excuse me if I am looking at my phone just slightly to get the live stream up. I'm just going to check that you're all seeing me. Please do add comments and questions. What we're going to say is if you add any comments along the way, we'll try and keep track of them. But really what we want you to do, we got Honey Harrison's viewing, so we must be live at least to her. So if you've got any questions, what we'll do is at some point I'll go, right, we're going to have just 10 minutes of questions now and put them up there. And so just because as we go through, we might answer questions as we go. So if you put them there too early, and plus it means I've got to keep track of them, which is another issue. So when I want to give all my attention to Dacre. So please do post your questions though. And hopefully I'll be able to see the comments through the video. Oh, and you can hear me there. I will just mute myself. So guys, thank you very much for joining us. And now we're going to get cracking. So Dacre, I believe we're going to go through some of the slides you use at events like Sci-Fi Weekender today.
Yeah, this is actually the first time because of your incredible knowledge, Squee, your doctoring knowledge of dealing with technology far beyond my capability. I've sent you versions of the slides that I normally show all over the world in what's called Stoker on Stoker. And this is an evolving series of presentations I give, and I've been doing it for probably about 8 years. And what's cool about it is anytime I find something new and interesting about Uncle Bram, his research, what somebody else has said intelligently about him, some of the cool trips that I've done to find interesting places that pertain to either Vlad Dracula or Count Dracula, I'll insert them into Stoker on Stoker. So what you're going to see today, just because we don't have a full hour and a half and I'm not in my element on a stage with a microphone, we're going to get some of the real top slides that I've selected for the Dr. Squee show and chat about them a little bit, and then certainly be open for some of your questions at the end of the presentation. So is that a good way to start, Squee?
It works for me, certainly, sir.
And so, this one's just a little bit different because with the success of Dracula, the prequel to Dracula that I co-authored with J.D. Barker, it actually was very big seller in the UK. This presentation shows how JD and I morphed my understanding and my research of Bram's life and his writing of Dracula and how we use that to write Dracula. So you're going to get sort of a 50-50 presentation today, Dracula and Dracula, and how both of them came to happen.
And just because I like to have my cake and eat it too, for anyone who's listening to this later in podcast form, if there's any of the slides you want to see, please do look at the video version, which we'll have up on the Dr. Squee Show Facebook page. And if you're watching this on Facebook right now, that probably sounds all confusing, but it's all what I used to say when I used to do a Doctor Who podcast is it's all timey-wimey. So don't worry about it. It's okay. Whichever format you're listening to, you can listen to it in the other format. So we have, through the fancy technology of StreamYard, we have the slides, I believe, right here.
There we go. Yep.
So we're going to try and not repeat anything which we went through the other day, but so we're going to start off on this slide. So previously when we spoke, Dacre, we'd taken you through the kind of like your earlier life a bit and your kind of Olympic journey, which you went through. and we'd started to talk about like your first trip over to Ireland. I believe we spoke about before.
Yeah, and this actually was one of my recent trips to Ireland because I'm standing in the Chapel Royale. I'm very proud and somewhat humbled because this is the Chapel Royale in Dublin Castle. And it is about 200 meters away from where Bram worked for a number of years as a clerk in the Petty Sessions Legal Department and then as the inspector. And I'm sure he attended services in this chapel. It's really cool because I was there last year presenting this slide presentation that you're going to see at the Bram Stoker Festival, which is another thing that the family's very proud of. And that is, Squee, that it took Dublin, Ireland quite a while to accept Uncle Bram as a writer of real substance. I mean, even though he was famous all over the world, the Irish were very proud of Yeats and Swift and all the others, Joyce. But because I think Bram wrote horror, it's been a while since they've really embraced him as an author. And I get it, because all over the world, I mean, horror has always had to fight for its way, its place in the pecking order. And it wasn't until, I believe, 1962, since Oxford University deemed it a classic. So it took the Irish a little bit longer, but nicely.
Do you think sorry to interrupt, but do you think there was especially a kind of like angle with the religion obviously being so strong in Ireland, especially at that time?
It's possible. It's really hard to tell. I think most of the sort of folks that I've talked to in the literary world have said it's purely horror. It's nothing personal. And it's not the fact that he wrote the book while he was in London. It's just horror just has had a hard time getting its fair share. So just moving forward, though, what's really nice is that we did become, when the book came out in 2018, which is a prequel to Dracula. And it's all about Bram's time growing up in Dublin, working in Dublin Castle, going to Trinity, and lots of shenanigans that happened, obviously, that have been fictionalized. The story is about 60-70% real. And much of it occurs in Dublin, Ireland. And it's Dracula, which became the #1 hardcover horror novel in England in 2018. And of course, I've popped up top of that a cover of that sort of, iconic mustard yellow covered book, Dracula. That's the original edition. That's actually my edition that we chatted about in your show last week, Squee. That's the one inscribed by Bram to his mother and then passed on through the different generations to me. So yeah, that's probably good for that slide. Let's move on to the next.
Sure.
Yeah, and this is just a little bit about sort of my literary career. We talked about all the other things, but I did start in 2009 writing a sequel to Dracula with Ian Holt called Dracula the Undead. And that just basically picks up the action 25 years after Dracula ends, very historically accurate. And the book also became an international bestseller. The next book in 2012 is interesting. It is nonfiction. It's actually a journal I found in the Isle of Wight in one of Bram's great-grandson's attic. And Paul Murray from Ireland actually had access to the book first, but Elizabeth Miller and I actually got to publish it on behalf of the Bram Stoker State of My Family. And it's a really cool insight into Bram's life. It covers an 11-year span. There's about 300 different entries in it. And it's all things, observations that Bram made, some poetry, some romance, some humor. I mean, all kinds of cool stuff that you wouldn't normally get to see about the guy who wrote Dracula, because it just wasn't really popular until 2012, which was the 100th anniversary of Bram's death. And then, of course, 2018, I just mentioned, Dracula came out. But in the meantime, because I've sort of been the voice of knowledge of Bram Stoker and Dracula, I keep getting asked to appear in some of these different videos, which is Vampire Legend, which was a British production called Secrets of the Dead. And that was a lot of fun. That's sort of looking at deviant burials around the world. And this particular segment was obviously about vampires in Bulgaria, Transylvania, in England, and how people actually treated these these vampires, and you could see that by how they dealt with their bodies, cutting their heads off, putting them between their legs, sometimes putting bricks in their mouth, actually. And then Mystery in the Museum was the segment I did. It's a show in the U.S. that is quite popular, where the host goes around different museums and finds cool things and decides to trace them. And in this case, we went back to Transylvania and actually looked at the Vlad the Impaler history and actually saw the interface where Uncle Bram actually decided where he got the name Dracula from, what he knew at that time, and how he merged those two together. So you have the Count Dracula emerging from the real Vlad Dracula history. And
did Bram literally go there himself?
No, that's the interesting thing, Squee, is he didn't. We know he went as far into Europe as Italy, where he actually went to have to bury his father, where he was living in his latter years. But we have no records of him going anywhere near Transylvania. But he did have access to some wonderful books in the London Library, and now we know each and every one of them by name, author. The books are still in the London Library, the same exact ones that Bram checked out, and I've been able to look through them all, and I could realize exactly how and why Bram was able to sort of paint a very accurate picture of Transylvania at the time, because there were adventurers that went there before him and did just that. They described the people, the locations, the cities, the modes of transportation. Even 4 of these books, Squee, actually had maps that Bram was able to unfold and use. And on 2 of them, there is the Borgo Pass, and they have the lines of longitude and latitude in them. And that's how he actually pinpointed his location for the famous battle at the end of the story, when the band of heroes confront the gypsies and manage to, let's just say, appear to put an end to Dracula just below the top of Mount Israel, where Castle Dracula was.
That's amazing. It just shows the kind of like level of research, which is obviously a family trait which went into the original book.
Yeah. Okay. So let's move on. So I start, and some of this I mentioned last week, so I'm going to go over it fairly quickly, because this is Bram Stoker's life and the different things in his life that I believe had an impact on him. So I call it the what so much Bram wrote, but the why he wrote it. And I love doing that with different authors that I enjoy reading. Bram Stoker is personal. So I had to figure out why he wrote Dracula in the manner he did. And to me, I use the term a perfect storm, all these different things coming together. So I'm going to quickly go through these bullet points because I know we touched on most of them last time. He was born in Black 47, which was a difficult time in Ireland, with all sorts of disease and suffering in the streets, people kind of walking around as the living dead, sort of like zombies with all their suffering. He was sick for the first 7 years of his life while he was observing all this horrible things going on. So he probably felt, a little bit sort of in that category himself, never knowing if he was going to, be alive much longer. And I do have a very good reason to believe that he was bloodlet by one of his uncles. And that was pretty horrific, because in those days, the treatise that I found by this uncle was that they weren't very scientific when they decided how much blood they were going to take out of anybody. And they'd take out enough for you to faint, and then they'd fill you up with claret, the alcohol, to help cleanse your system, which of course would make you drunk. Bram went on to Trinity, where he really developed into a really sort of almost like a supernatural person. He was a very tall guy, strong. You could see this image up above of actually the Dublin races. Bram was a champion race walker and gymnast, rugby player, rower, all around great athlete, and all around sort of great man of the campus of Trinity. But at the same time, at Trinity, he needed to go to work in Dublin Castle. And in a way, there was a confining kind of thing, the freedom of being a student and exercising your intellectual abilities and sports and all that. But then he was stuck down into this, lower office as an inspector of a very boring job, inspector of petty sessions. But he did rise up to become the inspector of petty sessions all over Ireland, which gave him the freedom to get on trains and carriages to travel all over the country. But in a strange kind of way, he did that, much like Jonathan Harker got on a train to do the land transaction, the legal transaction with the Count, Bram Stoker travels around as an inspector. It's a legal business where he's not always welcome when he shows up to inspect and make sure all these clerks are doing the right thing. One of Bram's ways to remain sane and to continue his sort of intellectual and his creative side was to write theatrical reviews in the local theaters. And he did this for the newspaper that Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu was the editor of. This is the gentleman, the author, famous author, who wrote Carmilla, one of the earlier vampire stories before Bram wrote Dracula. But this was his way to get to the theater, to critique it, something that he and his father did when Bram was younger. But the problem was when he ended up doing that, his father told him that the theater is no place for you. It's okay just for fun, but this is not a life for you, which I think was kind of sad. And then the final thing, which I'll talk a little bit more in the next slide, is that we have record of one particular story that Bram's mother read to him and then later on actually wrote down, typed up, and sent to him. So yeah, let's move on to the next slide, unless you've got some questions, Squee, on this one.
Yeah. There's just two questions I've got. One is about the bloodletting and then giving the claret afterwards. First of all, as someone who's half Irish, I think I'm allowed to say it just proves that we can solve anything with alcohol in Ireland. But do you think there's anything about the obviously the blood side of it? It's obvious how that links in, but the bloodletting and then giving someone alcohol straight afterwards, do you think that added to some of the thrall mythology?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I should have said whatever illness he had, we understand resulted in fevers and so on. So this was common to bloodlet. It wasn't a punishment. It was what they really thought was the right type of procedure, medical procedure. Take out the bad blood. So they understand when they take out this fluid, they've got to replace it with something. And the replacing with something is this alcohol, and sometimes they also gave oil, sort of the alcohol to kill whatever was bad inside, and the oil to sort of ease the passage, I guess. And so I think that this, somewhere in the back of Bram's, mind developed his own mythology of, what it's like to have somebody come along and take out your life source, take out the blood. Yeah. The blood is the life, it's coming out. And I think that it's possible that when he started putting pen to paper and writing Dracula, when he got to that stage of the vulnerable Jonathan Harker, who is a lot like Bram, and the women in white come along and take his blood and leave him in a weakened state, and he can't mount and escape from Castle Dracula very easily, I think there's a great parallel here. So I think his own circumstances, his own experience, and the vampire myth that he studies later on, it has this great synergy which comes together nicely.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about the idea of the kind of like the power that Dracula had over people, and kind of like they would be in this hazy state, and the mixture of bloodletting and then replacing it with alcohol, I think would leave you in that kind of like, I could imagine him thinking of that when he's writing that.
There's a lot of this talk in those days also of dream states and trances, and this sort of, as you just said, this sort of almost subconscious wandering around as the way that natural people would connect to the supernatural world. Realizing this is the late 1800s when the occult and spiritualism and just beginning to understand the mind was just in its infancy, nothing like we know today. So anybody who had bad dreams, nightmares, sleepwalking, it was thought by many this was them acting as supernatural creatures. And so I think you're absolutely right. I think this is the connection that Bram was trying to strive, because many people believe that in the day.
The other thing I just want to quickly touch upon was you mentioned the previous works of vampires, with vampires in it. Were they kind of recognizable? Because I feel like Dracula laid down so much of the mythology which people put into vampire novels now. Were they kind of similar to what we know a vampire mythos to be?
Yeah, sort of we call them the big three. The three books that preceded Dracula: John Polidori with The Vampire, that came out just after Frankenstein. And that was the first vampire in English literature that people have found. We understand there are other vampires in mythology around the world going way, way back. But in English literature, it was Polidori's the Vampire. And then J. Malcolm Reimer's Varney the Vampire, which was a serialized story, quite popular at the time. And then Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla. And then not too long after was Dracula. So Bram was sort of number 4 in line. But what was so significant about Bram's is that it had a real feeling of it being real. It was written in real time, as we'll get to, I think, in our next slide. So let's save that. And unless you've got any more, let's move to the next slide, and I'll sort of discuss why this book resonated so well in sort of British society.
Please.
Oh, no. Okay. First, we're going to go to cholera, because I said I just touch on this first. And it's kind of weird, Squee, because obviously right now the world is dealing with a pandemic all of its own, a coronavirus. But back in the 1832, this cholera epidemic was sweeping through Europe, and it eventually made its way to Ireland in a somewhat similar way. People had no idea what was causing it. They had no idea how contagious it was, no idea how to actually fix it. And so you see some of the posters in front of you, and there's actually a story, the top one, the little boy who came back from the dead, Tommy Guerin. He was buried prematurely, misdiagnosed and buried prematurely. And this typed up letter you see that lives in the Trinity College archives is actually one page of many. And it's the complete story that Bram's mother read to him when he was a sick little infant to keep him interested. And it was sort of typical back in those days. They didn't really discriminate about horror or romance or fun or anything else what they'd read their kids in Ireland. It didn't matter. It's a story, and they're a great nation of storytellers. So Bram was subjected to this story of how his mother in 1832 actually lived through the horrors of the cholera epidemic in Western Ireland, in the town of Sligo, where she grew up. And I don't have time to read it, the whole thing to you today, but I am going to give you a little excerpt from it. Because if you could just imagine you're the little boy Bram, age 0 to 7, not knowing if you're going to breathe your last breath or not, getting bloodlet in this kind of alcohol stupor from time to time. And you get the story told to you about the cholera that comes into this town where Bram's mom is about 12 years old, and she witnesses misdiagnosis and premature burial of one of their neighbors. And this is the little piece that just gets me. She said, the husband took his wife from next door, who was very sick, and wrapped a red scarf around her waist to try and relieve the pain, and put her on his back and took her to the hospital. And when they got there were no gurneys free, no beds free. So they just pull off the people who were nearly dead, and it didn't matter because they were in these sort of opium stupors as it was, because that's all they could do for these poor people. They couldn't fix them from the cholera, but they could ease their pain. So the nearly dead were sort of pulled off, and the next one, who was somewhat healthier, was put on the gurney, and then the husband goes off to work. And he comes back at the end of the day to find out how his wife is doing, and they say, "Oh no, she's gone." What do you mean she's gone? She passed. Well, where is she? I'd like to prepare a proper funeral. Well, by this time, in the second week of the cholera epidemic, all the priests were either dead or left town. The nurses were all dead or left town, and the street people are the ones making a few dollars dealing with the dead bodies. And they were misdiagnosing people because they had no medical experience. So one of them, or more than one, maybe two, brought this lady to the big pit at the end of the town. That's where they put all the bodies. They didn't have funerals anymore. Put some dirt, put some lime, more dirt, more lime, more bodies. And so this husband is going to pay his last respects and is looking for the body of his wife, and sees this red scarf. He goes in, even though he's risking himself by catching the contagious disease, gets all these bodies off and gives her a big hug to say goodbye. And she moves and realizes she's still breathing, and helps her crawl out of all these massive bodies of dead. She's misdiagnosed, and she goes on to live for many years. She didn't have the cholera at all. But I just imagine that this story resonated deeply with Bram, and enough so that Bram asked his mom years later to type up this letter you see in front of you, all 17 pages of it, and he used this in a book he wrote called Under the Sunset, which was a series of stories for children, and this one was this invisible giant that was coming and slowly killing people. So a perfect example, I believe, of one of these things in Bram's life that did stick with him long enough to make its way into Dracula. Okay, next slide.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It really seems like he's someone who took every drop of influence around him.
Yeah, I think so. All right, so here's where I actually talk about the novel, and I've already mentioned the epistolary style, memos, newspaper articles, and so on, real-life situations. He actually went to Whitby, where he got so enamored that he set chapters 6, 7, and 8 there, but he actually did the writing in Cruden Bay, Scotland. You can see the picture on the lower right, the black and white one, is actually a picture of Slains Castle in Cruden Bay and what it looked like while he was there. And I now believe, because of the help of Mike Shepard, that there's actually an octagonal room on the inside of that castle that Bram describes to a T in chapter 2. So that's how he was inside the castle on a social visit, and he described it in Castle Dracula later on. I believe that Bram and Harker are very similar characters, but I also believe he got information about Vlad Dracula from a guy called Arminius Vambury, who we'll talk about later. And I've already talked about the books in the London Library. The one person I haven't mentioned is this book on the right-hand side, this yellow cover called Land Beyond the Forest by Emily Gerard, who was actually introduced, her book was introduced to Bram by the American writer Mark Twain. And it's all about superstitions, mythology in Transylvania, which was very, very helpful when Bram had to attach traits to his fictional Count Dracula, as I mentioned, the guy that, the creature that he took from Vlad Dracula. And what was also interesting is Bram was a real techie, and he loved modern science and technology, and he utilized a lot of that in Dracula: the typewriter, the phonograph, the telegraph, the Kodak, which was the camera, blood transfusions, and this emerging science called mesmerism. And I believe that all of these had their place in the novel as a statement that Bram was saying, look, we've got Van Helsing, who is a connection between the modern medical world and the old world. He's the one explaining to us about how important it is to understand superstition. But then you have Dr. Seward, who is an example of Bram's other three brothers, who were all these medical doctors who are very narrow-minded, and all they can do is sort of think about the scientific process. And then Bram introduces this technology as a way that, we've got to battle the ways of the evil ways, the old ways that come from superstition with modern technology. And so what I simply love to tell interested readers is that next time you reread Dracula, pay particular attention to where these different elements are used, these different bits and pieces of very modern technology at the turn of the century.
And maybe this is just something which is coming into my head a lot at the moment, but I'm again thinking about like how it was Ireland again, still to this day is a very religious place, but especially back then, there were very, very strict rules about religion. I wonder if kind of there's some science versus religion in there.
There is a lot of science versus religion. I think,
yeah.
I could just say this. That's another show which I'd love to do, where we actually go to the novel and pull out the bits where you've got faith versus science, you've got good versus evil, the mentions of God, mentions of the devil, the evil one. There are so many layers, Squee, of this book that it's absolutely incredible. And I meet so many people around the world that love to read it, every other year, and they always find something else. But sadly, we'll be here until dinner time, or actually in your time till bedtime, if we get into that one now. But you're right; there is many overtones of that in the novel.
Okay, that's our Halloween show sewn up. If you don't mind coming back on.
Fair enough. Yep.
Okay, next slide.
So, well, just very briefly, this one just gives you a chance to look at one of the most iconic pages of Bram's notes. And if you look right in the middle of the page, this is where he listed all his characters. And of course, I've printed them out for you. But if you'll recognize in the middle of the page the word "the Count," and then a line, and then "Count" crossed out, Vampire, and then he writes in Dracula. This is the Genesis page for all the viewers of Bram Stoker deciding to change the setting of the story from Austria, or Styria, which was a part of Austria, and using a more Germanic name for how the Austrians referred to vampires as Vampire. And once he found the books in the London Library and in the Whitby Library, and changed the name of his count to Dracula. So this is like the Genesis page for that. And you'll all recognize the other characters. So let's not waste too much time on this, because again, we've got a lot to cover.
I'm just imagining it's like, would it have seemed so spooky if it was Austria as opposed to Transylvania? There's something so evocative about that. But is that because that's what we know it to be?
Yeah, and we also know that Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu set Carmilla in Austria, and I think that got Bram's initial attention. Oh, if he set this story here, it's got this kind of weird vibe to it. But then he went off to Whitby and found the name Dracula in the book and the London Library, and his whole idea of Whitby changed for the Landing of the Count, but then he switched it over to Transylvania because he found so many other good references to even a faraway country that's less is known about it in those days, Transylvania.
Yeah.
All right, next slide. Yep. So this is now beginning of how JD and I morphed into writing Dracula. These are the most important documents around the world pertaining to Bram Stoker's writing of Dracula. And so we played the role, as you mentioned earlier, Squee, as literary forensic detectives. We didn't discover all these things ourselves, but we looked at them in a different way. The Dracula notes in the Rosenbach, the original Dracula preface, which I will read you an excerpt from, the cholera story, which I just told you about, the typescript that we'll get to, that is the final thing that Bram had his hands on, handed it to a typing service. They typed it up, but strangely enough, it starts on page 102. And JD and I believe we understand what some of those missing pages were. The Lost Journal, which I did have a hand in publishing. And then we're all going to talk a little bit later about the Jane Stoddard interview. And then I am privy to talking with my cousins, Bram's great-grandsons, who actually were raised by Bram's son. So they're living people today in their late 70s that are a wonderful source of information, that love to chat about their grandfather that basically raised them, because both their dads died in World War II. Okay, next slide. So I am going to read this piece because imagine this is the beginning of how do you write a novel and how do you get a theme to write the novel. In this case, it's Dracula. And I had always had this strange feeling once I read this excerpt. Now, just to frame this up, this was found in 1989 by Richard Dalby, but it kind of sat dormant. And this is not the whole preface. You can Google it and find it. Icelandic preface. Hans de Roos, a Dutch-German researcher, actually found that it was used in the Icelandic edition, and another guy found, Rickard Berghorn, found that it was in a Swedish newspaper serialized in 1899, and nobody knew about it until de Roos actually had it translated back into English. I believe, because I wrote the introduction to the English translation of the Swedish of the Icelandic translation. So I was quite intimately involved in the publication of this book. And the more times I read this preface, the more times it was suggested to me, and I began to believe that maybe this story is real. And this would be a great jumping off point to fictionalize a prequel to Dracula as if the story was real. So here we go. This is Bram writing it. Very different than the preface that you see today in a regular copy of Dracula, I believe, because this one would have been too shocking for Archibald Constable to publish in 1897. I am quite convinced that there's no doubt whatever that the events here described really took place, however unbelievable and incomprehensible they might appear at first sight. And I am further convinced that they must always remain to some extent incomprehensible, although continuing research in psychology and the natural sciences may, in years to come, give logical explanations of such strange happenings which, at present, neither scientists nor the secret police can understand. All the people who have willingly or unwillingly played a part in this remarkable story are known generally and well respected. Both Jonathan Harker and his wife, who is a woman of character, and Dr. Seward are my friends and have been so for many years, and I've never doubted they were telling the truth. Now, it goes on to about twice as long as this, Squee, but it's the same theme. Bram is trying to convince the reader that the events here in this epistolary style are real, and we better take the threat of the vampire seriously. What JD and I did in Dracula is tell why he believes they're real.
What I love about that is it shows I almost want to say a little bit of naughtiness in there, and just like I love that thing of kind of wanting to play with the audience, want to play with the reality a bit. There's a bit of surrealism in there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let's move on to the next slide.
Right.
So the preface was number one. This was number two. Now, in the last show, we chatted about my sporting background, and I have competed as an athlete at the world championship level, qualified for the Olympics in 1980, but of course they were boycotted, and finally became a coach at the 88 Olympics and taught sport from middle school all the way up to the Olympics, so everything. And I've seen all sorts of things like illegal drug use, cheating, and great success stories, everything in between. And Bram's mysterious illness and his mysterious recovery to become a champion athlete, and here's only one of the trophies we have, that was contributed by bloodletting. I thought, well, wait a sec. Maybe there was some blood doping going on, or maybe there was some human growth hormone, or maybe some steroids. Obviously, wouldn't have been practical. They didn't know about that at the time. But that's how authors begin to think. And we also have this phrase called the what if phrase. What if the story was real? What if, when Bram was this mysterious child, his recovery was something of the supernatural nature? So originally I thought, well, there's lots of doctors in the family. Maybe they gave him some experimental potion. And when I brought this forward to J.D. Barker, we came up with another idea. And I can't spoil it for you. But it is a realistic approach to a prequel where certain things in Bram's life could easily have happened this way. And here's a picture of the treatise that Bram's uncle actually wrote all about bloodletting. So much more than that, I'll be guilty of spoilers, and I won't do that today.
But I will say that what I love about that is it seems like it's very in keeping, that because it's sort of like the snake eating its own tail, because Bram had put in all these things from his real life into the book, it then lends itself to you putting in some fiction into the real events, which would kind of like fit in the things he's paralleled.
That's exactly the same idea. If he took that sort of art, that writer's license to kind of slide in some reality, what we did is decide to slide in the opposite, slide in the fiction to the reality and blend it all together. Scholars call it the willful suspension of disbelief. And we decided we needed to follow that, make this story feel as real as Bram Stoker intended Dracula, and in many cases, as he did Dracula, with all the reality, the people, the places, the things that he put in Dracula to make it feel real. We tried to do the same. And I think we attained it.
And also it's that thing which he wanted to do with play with the audience with that previous preface of having like, you know, like, is it real? Is it not? And you've done that with him. It's beautiful. Like kind of like a beautiful parallel.
Okay, next slide. So here's one of these real things. His brother, Dr. William Thornley Stoker. He was the medical consultant. And when I say medical, I don't mean just the physical medical, but the psychological side. This Thornley Stoker was a very interesting character. He was Bram's oldest brother. He was the head of the Royal College of Surgeons, of doctors. He was actually knighted in 1912. He was a very much of a Dr. Seward type of person. And if you look at the slide off to the right side of the image of our screen, you'll see this human outline with the three little holes in the head. This is because Thornley Stoker was actually a groundbreaking surgeon, brain surgeon. And those little circles there are the holes where you do the brain trepitation. And it was actually how Bram wrote chapter 21 when they had to do the brain surgery on Renfield when he got beat up by Dracula for spilling the beans on where the presence of the master was, and he had a brain hemorrhage. And Seward and Van Helsing had to do this emergency surgery, consulted Thornley, and they cut open the head. But he also was a doctor at Swift's hospital. That's Jonathan Swift, the author, Gulliver's Travels, donated his money when he passed away to create this hospital for the insane, because Swift did go insane at the end of his life, and he felt that was a good way to treat people in Dublin at the time. Thornley was a doctor there, and he would have been the one that helped Bram do the characterization of Renfield, all of the manner of the speech patterns, his behaviors, and everything else would have come from Thornley. So it was a no-brainer for JD and I that Thornley was going to need to be a central character in our story, Dracula, in addition to the fact that his wife, Emily, really did go insane in her life, and he had to commit his own wife. So very interesting character, and very instrumental in the accuracy, the reality of the writing of Dracula.
And even though the kind of like some of the methodology may have changed, like doing boreholes into the head is still practiced to this day.
Yeah, it's funny. I actually brought this image to a brain surgeon friend of mine who I do a lot of fly fishing with, and he said, "What year was that?" And I said, "Well, late 1800s." He says, "Oh my God, that was really advanced for the day. You know, we're still. That's called brain mapping," he said. And when you read the information, he said, "We haven't found out a whole lot more since then." So it really is. That was cutting edge. Sorry, the pun.
No, it's amazing. It's amazing that because some of this stuff which Bram, I'm guessing, would have included into his book as the most cutting edge of modern science today would, been disproven. But there's so much of it. It's like he could pick the winners almost in a lot of cases of the science.
Yeah, exactly. For instance, like blood transfusions were just beginning at that time, but they didn't understand blood typing.
Yeah.
So his brother would have helped him. And as I went through the typescript, you can see things that Thornley did correct and did suggest, some of the things Bram put in and some he didn't, all because of accuracy. But sometimes if it's too accurate, you just get bogged down in too many details and you lose the reader. So Bram had to still be in charge of what to put in and what not to put in.
That's great.
Okay, next slide. So I mentioned earlier that Vanbury, I believe Vanbury was somebody that Bram got information from for his writing of Dracula. He is mentioned in Dracula, and he's mentioned by Van Helsing when he's explaining to the band of heroes, once they have figured out that this vampire is about who he really is. And he said, "My friend Arminius in Budapest University says he must have been this Voivode who fought the Turks over the Great River in Turkey land." And he goes on and says, "Arminius says this and this." So it's got to be this guy. And the reason I say that is what you see in front of you is actually a seating arrangement card at the Lyceum Theater restaurant, which is this restaurant in the back of the Lyceum called the Beefsteak Club. And as you go around the table, you see H.I. on the far left, Henry Irving sitting next to Mrs. Stoker, Bram's wife, next to a guy called Grusha, who was the assistant to the secretary of the Prime Minister of Hungary, Edie Terry, Tom Stoker, Bram's brother, and then Vanbury, next to Ellen Terry, the famous actress. And then McMichael, that's Mr. McMichael is sitting there, and across the table is Mrs. McMichael. Funnily enough, they're visiting from Philadelphia. And then Loveday is the set designer for the Lyceum. And then Teddy Terry, Ellen's other child, and then B.S. Bram Stoker sitting next to Mrs. McMichael. So that was in April of 1890, end of April, just 2 months before Bram headed off to Whitby for his holiday, and where he ended up learning an awful lot about Vlad the Impaler. No record, and there's no record of Vambury in the notes and the Dracula notes. And so I believe that there was probably more pages than 125 pages of notes that Bram used for his novel over 7 years. That's probably a no-brainer. But Bram didn't have to write down everything. And this conversation that he had with Vambury was probably one that sort of like, oh, you understand things about the Ottomans, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Let's, someday can you give me more? And so it probably just opened the door for Bram knowing or getting a knowledge base to pursue it in the London Library and the Whitby Library, all about Vlad the Impaler.
I just love
that means that JD and I had good purpose to include him in our story, because I think he was the model, this Eastern European guy that understood a lot of things that nobody in the Band of Heroes did. And I think he had elements of him was Van Helsing. Not the whole thing, but elements was used and came out in the character Van Helsing.
I just love this. This seems like a thing which could have easily been discarded, and just to find that little bit of the puzzle is such a gift.
Yeah, and I think the key thing is that he's mentioned by name from Budapest University in Dracula. So yeah, it is a little teeny piece of the puzzle, but it's a strong piece because he's got two mentions in the novel. All right, next slide. Getting things right and accurate, as you mentioned earlier, Squee, was very important for Bram, and it is for JD and I, because fans would roast us if we didn't get things right. So this is a drone footage of Whitby Abbey and St. Mary's Church and the graveyard. And it's very hard to point out without one of those little laser pointers here. But I ask our viewers, if you sort of went to the very, very middle of the picture where all these sort of paths converge, and move up towards sort of 12 o'clock, as if this was a clock, with practical numbers, not digital.
Yeah.
And you'll see you're heading towards this big pier in a direct line from the middle, and you're going to go through the graveyard, which looks like lots of little bumps, but that's actually a graveyard. Just outside that graveyard looks like little dots. And what that is are rocks signifying the non-consecrated graveyard outside the regular graveyard in Whitby. And that is important because in folklore, and some people take this more serious than folklore, anyone who commits suicide, has weird defects, strange, unexplained death, they're suspected of being somewhat supernatural, and they cannot be buried in the consecrated graveyard. They get buried in that teeny little graveyard just outside. And funnily enough, there are a number of people who jump over those cliffs at Whitby or die in strange manners. So they aren't buried in the regular graveyard. And when JD and I were writing our story, we needed to have, let's just say, without giving spoilers, vampiric presence. We needed to find where is the unconsecrated graveyard. Many graveyards around the world have that little section to them. They're not within the confines of the consecrated graveyard. So we found one, and that was very helpful to us to plot the story and to actually write the story and all the movements of the different characters, knowing exactly where that was. That's all I really need to say.
Yeah. Oh, so many things which you could say about that kind of practice, but great for horror, certainly.
Yep. So the next slide, let's go to that one, because equally as important as the graveyard in Whitby is the way Whitby Abbey looked back in the time when we set the story. So that central tower, the keep that you see right there, which was not in the other picture, which was a modern day picture, that was there when Bram visited in 1868, which was when our story took place. Obviously, these things tumble down because of age, but in this case, it actually was shot down by a missile from the or cannon fire, I should say, from a German ship in World War II, because they didn't like the World War I, I believe. They didn't like the fact that the British had put up a radar tower on top of it obviously for radar. And so it was there in 1860, but I think by around 1920, it had been knocked down. So when people read Dracula and there's a lot of action that happened in that tower, they say, "Oh no, that's not true. The tower is not there." I said, "It's not there now, but it was there back in 1868." So we have proof of that, which is something, as you mentioned earlier, it's important to me to get things right, just like it was for Bram, set that tone.
Yeah, so it's like it's as well as visiting it as a primary source, you've got to know that obviously things can change over a few hundred years, and kind of what was that like then? Like, you know, if you're walking there then and you're looking up at this tower, how does that change things? It's again, it's fascinating how you put these things together. Yeah, it's great.
Okay, next slide.
Oh, we may have run out of the slides. Was it? It's 13 slides I had.
Oh, okay. That actually winds up this, because that's about right. So I guess what I wanted to sort of make sure, if people have read Dracula and they're listening now, or they do end up reading it, we have a style of writing that JD brought to the table that I wasn't aware of. He was a much more accomplished writer than I was. And that was, you make the reader feel a little bit challenged. Nowadays we get so comfortable sitting in front of our television or computer screen and being entertained without really thinking. And JD's premise was, let's challenge them. This is a challenging story. This is something where you really have to think. And we have what's called the now section. And then we have the epistolary style of going back in time through Bram's journals, his sister's journal, William Thornley Stoker's journal, and Vanbury. And so intersperse these different journals and diary entries, you've got the now section. And the now section is actually not present day, modern day. It's when Bram turned around and looked back to start writing this story. And that occurs in the tower that you guys just saw. That's where the now section happens. And it was an interesting genesis, because when I started pursuing JD after having read a book called Forsaken, his first book, I thought, I really like the style in which you write. And he said, yeah, but there's one more thing I want to do. And I said, what's that? He said, I've always had a personal nightmare of being in a room with something behind a door, some power behind the door, and trying to build up my confidence how to face it. And so even though I had the Bram story in my mind, and I actually had a pretty good outline for it, we call it sort of the story Bible, JD had a really cool idea on how to present this when we got to writing. And so I said, JD, let's go with this. I mean, how do you think it could fit in? And he came back with his version of the outline, which was magnificent, using a character in this room who is then keeping notes in his journal about how he's feeling as he's dealing with this power. And of course, everything comes together in the final third of the book. It all makes sense. But we wanted to challenge the reader at the beginning to try and figure out what's happening. Where is this going? Much like the puzzle, Squee, that we chatted about. Same as my research. It's all a puzzle. And then it all, just the way it comes, if you do a jigsaw puzzle, how good it feels in the last third or last quarter when you start putting things together. You got, yes, I did it. I get it. It makes sense. I love this story. I love this puzzle.
Okay, in a second, we're going to take your questions. If you've got any, please do write them down, and we'll ask them of Dacre in a second. If you haven't, that's cool. If you have, please write them down. In the meantime, Dacre, one thing I'm wondering is, you've got this wealth of information you found out, so much of which has influenced your book. Was there anything which you found out which you didn't fit slightly, but was nonetheless fascinating to you?
Ah, boy. I'll just say to date, there are so many things I've found. I keep this auxiliary file. And in that file, I found, strangely enough, I'm keeping, it's not a book, but it's on my computer, something very similar to what I believe Bram Stoker is keeping in his lost journal. Story ideas, real things. So you got to remember, Bram was only one of 7 kids. And so as I was digging around, especially for Dracula, I found all kinds of interesting things about the other children in the family, about his parents, and some of the people in his lives, obviously Florence Stoker, his wife, and Oscar Wilde and his family. So I wouldn't say right now there's nothing I couldn't use. It's just that I haven't used it yet. I've decided to. It's not the right time to put something about some element of Bram's life that needs to be fleshed out and completed, or about his brother. I mean, for instance, George Stoker, my great-grandfather, his youngest brother, was a very interesting guy, and they were very close, Bram and George. And there's an incredible story about Bram Stoker on his way to the Lyceum Theatre. He's living in Chelsea. He takes a ferry on the Thames to head up into the city. And he actually, in a heroic gesture, sees a man jump overboard to commit suicide. And Bram throws off his coat and his shoes and gets, not all of his clothes off, but enough so he won't drown, jumps in, and being a very strong athlete and a strong swimmer himself, drags this guy out of the river and gets out of the Thames. I mean, just disgusting water in those days, gets him up onto the street on his back, and then brings him to his house just a few blocks away. And luckily, George is there, and they try to revive him, because George Stoker, when he was younger, before he was married, was living with Bram in London when he was doing his medical practice, his medical schooling, excuse me. And they tried to revive the guy, and they didn't. So he died on the dining room table. And the story goes that Florence Stoker was so upset with a dead body lying around in the house that she forced him, within a year or so, to move to another house. Now that's a story. Don't know how much that part's true, but we do know that Bram was awarded a bronze medal by the Royal Humane Society for efforts to save a dying person. Apparently, you get a gold medal if you save the guy and he actually lives. So there's bronze medal for a bloody good try, a gold medal, a really good try, and it's effective. But there's kind of stories like that about the brothers and things that that I'm keeping in a file to come out later, because I think I've got a lot more to tell. And also, Dracula ends, Squee, in 1890 when Bram decides to start writing Dracula. And the premise of JD and mine is that he writes Dracula as this warning to the world. So we still have a 7-year gap between 1890 and 1897 to write our continuation of Dracula. But our agent has said, don't write this book until Paramount goes ahead and exercises their rights and actually turns it into a movie, because your continuation of the story would be much more valuable and more relevant if your book is in production into the movie. So we're on hold with that, but that's also where other things will go. And that's why I really can't talk about them, because I don't want to give away some of the juicy stuff for what could become another really good novel.
Okay, we haven't got any questions yet, but again, guys, if you've got any questions, please do post them and ask them. But other thing which I'm curious about, I like to ask some advice from my guests so I can kind of help grow as a creative myself. So what would you say to anyone as some advice if they wanted to be as meticulous as you are in kind of researching and putting together a work of fiction, or, any book really?
Well, I think the thing to do is to go in with an open mind and find ways to get yourself invited to conferences where you listen to other people's points of view. That research is one thing, hardcore research by looking at, Googling things and looking at archives, sitting at home and compiling your files of information about maps and sources of information. Historical clubs are a great way to find out what is going on in the time frame that you're trying to write your story. And it's like an onion. The deeper you go, the more information you get. So get that information, compile it. I mean, here's an example. For instance, in that tower that I mentioned in the novel Dracula, we have a rifle. The character in the room, Bram Stoker, has a rifle. I knew darn well that if that rifle was not described accurately and it wasn't a type of rifle that would readily be available at that date, in that location, in that country, it would ruin the story for some people. And it would also give reviewers to say, oh, they were shoddy researchers. They didn't do a complete research. So anytime we introduce something like that, a person, a place, a thing, it was my job, with the help of my wife, often to dig and find out, how do we get this thing to be absolutely sure that the gun worked that way? How did it load? How did it discharge? Would it be a type of gun rifle that Bram Stoker would have had access to? Create this provenance, because you will be caught out on it. People will love to catch you out on that. So be thorough. But beyond that, Squee, it's not just the Googling. It's not just the nuts and bolts. Eventually, you've got to go to these countries, save your money, and go to these places and suck up the authenticity of the atmosphere. Walk in Dublin. Find the old places where you're trying to set your story. Go into the old churches, the old museums, the old libraries, and get a feel for what it smells like, what it feels like, how warm or how cold it is. And that's the second half of this research. Bram was unfortunate. He couldn't go to Transylvania. He did everything he could, though, to create the atmosphere, and that's by doing thorough research. But luckily, nowadays you can get on a jet plane, at least when this bloody pandemic goes, and you're safe to go places. That's the second half of being a thorough researcher, is creating the feel so you can use that in your writing. And when you do this writing, you got to be careful how many words you use. You don't want to waste words creating atmosphere, because your editors will always be chopping you down. So you've got to choose those words wisely, and that's why they need to be as useful words and the best words to make sure you describe these places. And there's nothing better than being there yourself and doing it, rather than taking them from a book and hoping that they work.
I find there's something magic about this, that people put together this podcast and your book, and in the original Dracula, they can do a tour. Like, if obviously this creates a need for a bit of money and perhaps a bit of time, but people could do a world tour of all these influences. And even like you've done, you went to places which Bram Stoker was only writing about secondhand from very good sources by the sounds of things, but you've done a journey not even the author did. That's incredible.
It's funny. I've done that beforehand to write the story. But now there's been this call from people going, "Oh, we'd love to go to Whitby. Why don't you lead a tour there? We'd love to go to Dublin, Ireland. Why don't you bring us there?" I've already been leading people to Transylvania. I've actually been there about 10 times, and I think 4 of them have been on with tours of 6, 7, 8, 10 people. And I really enjoy helping people feel that same vibe, even though somebody reading a book is going to feel it differently than me, one of the co-authors. But you still want to bring them there so they could experience that vibe themselves. And of course, I have invented this idea that people flock to New Zealand to go see where The Hobbit was filmed, and they go to Rome, Italy to see where Angels and Demon and Da Vinci Code, and they follow the track. And people go to Whitby without me, of course, and have been going for a long time, and they can literally wander around, and see where all the elements and the action has happened in chapter 6, 7, and 8. What I've started to do is take people now to Cruden Bay, Scotland, where Bram Stoker actually spent 13 summers and wrote 3 books there. Waters, Mao, Mystery of the Sea, and Dracula. And started to go to Dublin and show, well, would you like to come and see where Bram Stoker was educated? See the house he was born in. They do have a cool, like a museum, a Dracula experience there, which is really neat, with a really cool show that sort of ties everything together. Marsh's library that has these, some of the actual table that Bram sat at in 1866, did his research, along with books that he looked at. London Library is a private library, so it's not easy to get in unless you go with a member to go and look at some of those books. But the British Museum has a library where Bram did, and some papers are still there. Trinity College. So there is sort of a side industry, and I just don't have time to do it all the time, but I do enjoy it to take people to go see those things, because what's amazing is Dracula means so much to so many people. I can only hope that one day Dracula has the same draw, that people want to go see all those places, because actually they are the same places that Dracula took place. So it's easy to sort of hit both at the same time.
And it's just, I think it's an interesting thing that now lots of authors have these, like, you look at James Bond just pulling something out of the air, like these places where we can go around the world due to modern technology, like due to airplanes and all this. But Bram was, before that was the thing, he was writing a book which is set in so many locations, which goes places. And that just seems like an incredibly ahead of his time thing to have done.
It was, and luckily he had those resources. We know he had traveled to Paris. We know he's gone to Munich. We know he's gone to Italy to bury his father. So he was obviously used to traveling in Europe. We also know he came to America 8 times as the manager of the Lyceum Theater. And during those 8 trips, he was responsible not just to get himself, the manager, across the Atlantic, but all of the actors and the actresses, but also the stage workers and the set designers and all that stuff. So it was a massive undertaking for him to do, which gave him really helpful experience, because as I'm now actually working on an annotated Dracula with Robert 18 Bassang, we just finished the section where all of the logistics needed to get the 50 boxes of dirt from Whitby into the 3 different locations in London. As I read that, I'm reading, this is all firsthand experience Bram had. He's got to hire these different people to take the boxes off the ship, load them, get them to the Whitby train station, load them on the different trains. They're going to the different train stations. And he mentions all the train stations, all accurately. He even mentions, which I thought was funny, that one of the workers complained that the guy who had hired him didn't provide any liquid sustenance to help load the boxes and make it easier. So it's like, I am sure that in Bram Stoker's day, when he was responsible for having the crates of things loaded for the Lyceum Theater or unloaded at the other end, he was probably the man there with a bottle of whiskey to hand to these boys, or little shot glasses to thank them at the end of the day. So I'm sure that his experience as the manager of the Lyceum Theater came through in lots of ways, not just giving drink to the laborers.
Well, it doesn't look like we've got any questions right now, but luckily for our dear listeners and our watchers, if they're watching this later, they can catch you at a live event coming soon, early next year for Sci-Fi Weekender. You're going to be joining us again.
Yeah, I'm so excited. I went last year at Great Yarmouth. It was wonderful. It's so much fun to be up close and personal with all these folks. So what I normally do is 1 or 2 of these different performances, an interview, in one of the rooms where people can ask questions, or I'm sitting at a table. My good friends, Samantha Lee Howe and David Howe, run Telos Publishing, and they also are parts of the organizers of the SFW. They've got this massive table, And some of the books that I've actually published, in addition to Dracula, they published Stoker on Stoker, which is the companion book to this presentation that you just saw. It actually goes a little bit longer because we had more time to put more elements into this little booklet, along with some short stories. The full story, the actual cholera story that we were chatting about, Squee, that I gave you a little excerpt from, is in that book that Telos published. And also, David really was instrumental in pushing me to put out my own version of Dracula with some of the things that have been taken out, like the short story Dracula's Guest, that was once part of Dracula, that got put in this book. And I'll spend just a short period of time on it because it dovetails perfectly with Dracula. Dracula, being the prequel, ends in this strange German village outside of Munich, which is where Dracula was supposed to have started before either Bram or his editor decided to take it out. So it was, as I mentioned in these notes earlier, one of 17 or 20 pages of the missing 101 pages of the typescript. And that story is put back into the Telos version of Dracula. So I will be in Great Yarmouth next year. We can chat more, sign books, sign almost anything, and answer any questions that anybody might have at that time.
In the meantime, where can they find you, sir, and where can they buy the book, most importantly?
Oh, Dracula is published by Transworld. Yes, I am at dacrestoker.com. That's my website. You can follow me on Facebook. And another little plug for an interesting venture that I've just it's continuously evolving, but it's the Dracula store on Etsy.com, which some really cool products that are being created with the Dracula book covers, different images and things inspired by the novel Dracula. So go there, follow me on Dracula, dacrestoker.com, or even the bramstokerestate.org. All ways to follow me or get more information from me about Bram Stoker or in any of the books that I've co-authored. But thank you, Squee, for your time, and thank you for making this wonderful interview possible. I appreciate it.
Oh, thank you so much. It's been wonderful. And I get the feeling you probably can hear Bram in your head sometimes. And I feel like we've joined you in that a little bit over these last two conversations.
Wonderful. I have felt his presence at times, and I hope you guys have picked up a little bit of that too, because that's important.
Well, for the Dr. Squee Show, I've been Dr. Squee. Joining me has been
Dacre Stoker.
And please join us next time. Bye.